I want you to stop scrolling for just a second, because if you have ever stood in the middle of your quilting space, and I use that word loosely, because maybe it is a corner of your bedroom, maybe it is a folded-up card table in the hallway, maybe it is literally your kitchen floor on a Sunday afternoon, and felt like you just cannot get it together, then this video is for you. And here is what I need you to hear right from the start, because I am going to keep coming back to this all the way through this video. You do not need more space. You need a better system. Those are two completely different problems, and the crafting industry has done a masterful job of convincing you they are the same problem, because the solution to the same problem is always something you can buy. A bigger cutting table, a new storage unit, a specialty pressing station that costs $400 and takes up a third of your room. I have been quilting and sewing for well over a decade. I have worked in spaces as small as a 6x8 spare room, and I have made competition-quality quilts. In every single one of them, the difference was never the space. It was always the system. So today I am going to give you 5 specific, actionable things you can do right now. Not after you reorganize your whole house, not after you save up for new furniture, but right now, with what you already have. And I promise you, by the end of this video, your quilting sessions are going to feel calmer, faster, and a whole lot more productive. There is also a specific pressing trick I use that completely transformed how my blocks come together, and I am going to share that with you a little later on. So stick with me through all 5 of these because they do build on each other. Let's start with number 1, and this one might sting just a little, but I need you to hear it. The very first thing you need to do: stop adding to your setup before you have audited what you already have. I mean a real audit, not the mental inventory you do while you are lying in bed at night thinking about your stash. I mean you pull everything out, you put it on a surface, and you look at it. All of it, every ruler, every spool of thread, every half-used pack of Schmetz needles, every marking pen you bought and forgot about, every fat quarter, that has been folded in the same position for so long it has a permanent crease. You look at all of it because I will guarantee you that somewhere in that pile is the solution to at least 3 problems you thought you needed to spend money to fix. I did this exercise myself about 4 years ago, and I found 2 complete sets of quilting rulers I had forgotten I owned. Because they were buried under fabric in a bin, I stopped going through. I found 4 rotary cutters, 4, in various stages of blade life, and I found enough neutral thread to last me probably 2 full years. The sticker shock of quilting notions and tools is real, I know that. A good quilting ruler is not cheap. A Alpha or OLFA rotary cutter, a reliable seam ripper, quality pins, a Clover Wonder clip set, these things add up fast. But the best version of that investment is the one where you are not duplicating it by accident, because your current system has no visibility. Visibility is the whole game in a small space. If you cannot see it, you will either forget you own it or you will buy it again. Both of those outcomes cost you money and they both cost you space. So the audit is step 1, and when you do it, you are sorting into 3 piles. Pile 1 is your active tools, the things you reach for in literally every single quilting session without exception. Your primary rotary cutter, your most used rulers, your go-to thread colors, your seam ripper, your pins or clips, your marking tools. That is your inner circle. Pile 2 is your specialty items, the things that are genuinely useful, but only for specific techniques or specific projects. Your specialty rulers, your bias tape makers, your English paper piecing supplies, your applique pressing sheets. These are real tools with real value, but they do not need to live on your main work surface. Pile 3 is everything else, and you need to be ruthless here. Duplicate tools that are worse versions of something else you own, notions for techniques you tried once and hated, that specialty thread in a color you will genuinely never use again. These things are clutter. They are not a backup plan. They are noise in your system, and in a small space, noise is expensive. Now, here is the thing about pile 3 that I want you to hold on to. A lot of quilters feel enormous guilt about this pile, because crafting culture has a very complicated relationship with waste. You spent money on that stuff. Getting rid of it feels like admitting a mistake, but here is how I want you to reframe that. That specialty bias tape maker you used once in 2019. It is not wasted if it goes to someone who will actually use it. Your local guild swap table, a Facebook distash group, a thrift store that benefits a nonprofit. That tool has more value in motion than it does sitting in a bin, making it harder for you to find the things you actually need. Letting it go is not waste. Keeping it at the expense of your own workflow is waste. The goal of this first step is to get to a place where everything in your active zone has a job, everything in your specialty zone has a clear home it returns to, and everything in pile 3 is out of your workspace entirely. Once you have done that audit, you are ready for number 2, and this is where we get into the real mechanics of your workspace, because this is where most quilters are bleeding the most time without realizing it. Number 2 is about your cutting station, and specifically about how to create a cutting setup that is efficient, ergonomically sound, and takes up far less real estate than you think it needs to. Here is the number 1 mistake I see in quilters' cutting setups. The cutting mat is too small for the workflow. Not because a bigger mat is always better. I am not telling you to go buy a giant mat. Because people are constantly fighting their mat instead of working with it. When your mat is too small for the fabric you are cutting, you are folding and repositioning constantly, and every single fold introduces the possibility of misalignment. And in quilting, misalignment compounds. A quarter-inch error at the cutting stage becomes a half-inch error when you are sewing your blocks, and by the time you are assembling rows, your quilt is telling on you loudly. This is why I am a huge advocate for working with adding machine tape as a measuring and alignment guide directly on your cutting mat. You can map out your cutting lines for an entire project, tape them right to the mat, and your fabric goes down the same way every single time. It sounds almost too simple, but I have used this trick in a 6-foot-long hallway serving as my cutting zone, and I have cut with the same precision as I would in a full studio. Now let's talk about the surface itself, because a dedicated cutting table is a luxury, not a requirement, and I want to debunk the idea that you need one to cut accurately. What you actually need is a firm, flat surface at a height that does not destroy your back. The back issue is real. Hunching over a low surface for 30 minutes will end your quilting session faster than anything else. If you are working on a dining table, you can raise your cutting mat with a piece of half-inch foam board underneath it, which buys you an inch or 2 of height, and also gives your mat a little grip on slick table surfaces. If you are working on the floor, which many of us do, and will continue to do, invest in a kneeling pad and work in short bursts. The floor is actually a great equalizer for very large pieces because you are not fighting gravity, but you have to protect your body to make it sustainable. The other thing I want you to understand about your cutting station is the concept of a one-directional workflow. Everything in your cutting process should move in one direction. Fabric comes in from one side, cut pieces go out to the other side. This sounds obvious until you look at most quilters' cutting setups, where fabric is coming and going in every direction. Rulers are stacked in random spots, and there is no clear logic to where anything lives. When you establish directionality, you cut faster, you lose pieces less often, and you spend less time making micro decisions about where to put things down. Your rotary cutter lives on the right side of your mat. If you are right-handed, left side if you are left-handed. Your rulers live in a line at the back of your mat, in the order you reach for them. Your cut pieces have a landing zone, a small tray, a folded cloth, even just a clear section of table. That is always to the left or always to the right, but it is always the same. This is the kind of system that does not require more space. It requires intention, and intention is free. I also want to give you a quick but very important note on rotary cutter blade maintenance here, because a dull blade is one of the most underestimated sources of frustration in quilting, and it absolutely wrecks a small space cutting session. When your blade is dull, you apply more pressure to compensate. More pressure means your ruler shifts. Ruler shifts mean your cuts drift. Drifted cuts mean blocks that do not come together cleanly. And then you spend 3 times as long at the sewing machine, trying to fix what the cutting station broke. A sharp blade is not a luxury, it is infrastructure. I change my blade more often than most people tell you to. The guideline you will see in most places is every 2 to 3 projects, but if I am cutting through multiple layers of cotton quilting fabric, I am checking that blade's performance. After every single project without exception, the test I use is simple. If the blade does not glide through a single layer of quilting cotton with almost zero pressure, the blade is done. Trying to squeeze more life out of a dull blade is a false economy. The blade is cheap. The time you lose and the errors you create with a dull blade are not. Now we are going to move into number 3, and this is the one I promised you a pressing trick on, so we are getting there. But first I need to give you the full context of why pressing matters so much in a quilting setup, especially a small one. Because in a small space, your pressing station and your sewing station and your cutting station are often the same table or the same general area. And the way those 3 zones interact is everything. Number 3 is your pressing station, and I need you to understand something about pressing that nobody tells beginners and that even intermediate quilters often get wrong. Pressing is not ironing. I am going to say that again because it genuinely matters. Pressing is not ironing. When you iron, you move the iron back and forth across the fabric in a sliding motion. That motion stretches bias edges, distorts pieced seams, and turns a perfectly cut block into something that looks like it went through a gentle argument with itself. When you press, you lift the iron, you set it down, you apply downward pressure, you lift it again. That is it. Lift, set, press, lift. And the difference in what that does to your seam allowances and your block accuracy is dramatic. I have watched quilters completely transform the flatness and precision of their work just by changing this one physical habit, and it costs absolutely nothing. No new equipment, no new supplies, just a different motion. Now, your pressing station in a small space has to be smart, because a full-size ironing board is a significant footprint. And if you are like most quilters working in tight quarters, your ironing board is either permanently set up somewhere inconvenient, folded against a wall where it takes 3 steps to open and close, or it is functioning as an auxiliary shelf, which means it has approximately 47 things piled on it at any given time, and you have to excavate it before you can press anything. Any of those scenarios adds friction to your workflow, and friction in a small space is the enemy of momentum. When pressing feels like a production, you skip it. And when you skip pressing between steps, your blocks drift, your points do not match, and you end up doing far more seam ripping than you ever needed to. So here is the setup I use, and this is the pressing trick I have been promising you. Instead of a full ironing board, I work with a portable wool pressing mat, and I cannot overstate how much this changed my workflow. These mats are typically around 17 by 24 inches. They sit flat on whatever surface you are already working on, and because they are wool, they retain heat and reflect it back up through your fabric from underneath. At the same time, the iron is pressing from the top. What that means in practical terms is that your seam allowances set faster, your blocks come out flatter, and you need fewer passes of the iron to get a crisp result. I have used Maywood Studio pressing mats. I have used the Greyline linen option, and I have used several off-brand versions I picked up at quilt shows. And the wool ones consistently outperform the padded cotton alternatives for one very specific reason: the heat retention. Cotton mats absorb heat and diffuse it. Wool mats hold it and redirect it. That double-sided heat action is the whole secret. And once you feel the difference in how your blocks come off a wool mat versus a standard ironing board cover, you will not go back. The other thing a portable pressing mat gives you is placement flexibility. It lives on your cutting table. It lives on your sewing table. It moves to wherever you are in your workflow without requiring you to walk across the room, without requiring you to clear a separate station, and without requiring any dedicated floor space at all. In a small setup, the ability to press right where you are sewing, to flip a seam, press it, and go right back to sewing without leaving your chair is an enormous time saver. I call this proximity pressing, and it is one of the single biggest efficiency upgrades available to anyone working in a small space. The fewer steps between your sewing machine and your iron, the more likely you are to press every single seam the way it needs to be pressed, and the better your finished quilt is going to look. I also want to address steam here, because there is a real divide in the quilting world about whether to use steam when pressing quilt blocks, and I have a strong opinion on it that I want to give you with the full reasoning. Steam used incorrectly stretches fabric. Full stop. If you are pressing a bias edge, a curved seam, or any piece that has been cut off grain even slightly, steam plus pressure plus any lateral movement equals distortion. The quilters who swear off steam entirely have usually had exactly this experience and blame the steam itself. But steam is not the villain, technique is the villain. Used correctly, with a pure lift-hand set motion and no lateral drag at all, steam is extraordinarily helpful for setting seams crisp and flat, especially with 100% cotton quilting fabric, which responds beautifully to steam. I use steam for setting final seam allowances on blocks. I do not use steam on bias edges period, and I do not use it on any seam I am not completely confident is cut on grain. That is the rule. Steam is a precision tool, not a shortcut, and once you apply it that way, it becomes one of your best allies at the pressing station. The other pressing tool I will mention here briefly is Steam Seam 2, which is a fusible web tape product that I reach for constantly in my applique work and in my binding prep. It is repositionable before it is fully fused, which means you get to adjust placement before you commit, and the bond it creates when fully set with a hot iron and steam is extremely durable through washing. I am mentioning it specifically in the context of your setup, because Steam Seam and similar fusible products require a pressing surface that can handle repeated high-heat application without degrading. And this is yet another place where the wool mat outperforms a standard ironing board cover over time. The cover on most ironing boards starts to compress and scorch with heavy fusible use. Wool handles it without flinching. Keep that in mind when you are thinking about your pressing station investment. All right, let's move to number 4, and this is the one that deals directly with your fabric, your stash, your scraps, and the gilt pile that is probably sitting in a bag or a bin somewhere in your space making you feel vaguely stressed every time you look at it. Number 4 is building what I call a functional scrap system, and the key word there is functional. Not beautiful, not Instagram-worthy, functional. A system that you will actually use every single time, that requires almost no maintenance, and that makes your scraps an asset instead of a liability. Here is the truth about quilting scraps that the industry does not want you to internalize too deeply. Your scrap pile is money. It is already purchased, already washed, already loved fabric that is sitting in a bag doing nothing for you because it has no system around it. Every time you cut a new block and toss the leftovers into a bin without any organization, you are creating future chaos for yourself. And then 6 months later, you are buying new fabric for a scrappy project when the fabric you needed was already in that bin, uncut and unidentified, buried under everything else. I have done this more times than I would like to admit, and it is not a character flaw, it is a system flaw. The fix is simple, but you have to actually do it. The functional scrap system I use has 3 tiers based on size, because size is the only characteristic that actually determines how a scrap can be used. Tier 1 is anything larger than a fat eighth, roughly 9 by 22 inches or larger. These are big scraps, and they are genuinely useful for small blocks, borders, binding strips, and background pieces. They get folded and stored with your regular stash, full stop, because that is what they are. They are just small pieces of fabric. and they deserve to live with the rest of your fabric. Tier 2 is anything between 2.5 inches and fat eighth size. These are your true working scraps. Strip widths, small squares, half-square triangle leaders, and enders material. These live in a single clear bin or bag sorted by color family. Not by print, not by collection, not by anything complicated. Just color. Warm colors together, cool colors together, neutrals together. That is the whole system. When you need scraps for a scrappy block, you reach into the color bin you need, and you have everything you are looking for in one place. Tier 3 is anything under 2.5 inches. And here I am going to say something that is going to feel uncomfortable, but that I believe completely. Most of those tiny scraps are not worth your storage space. There are exceptions: English paper piecing, some hexy work, very small applique shapes. But for the vast majority of quilters, the tiny scraps are not saving money, they are costing space and creating clutter. Compost bin, a textile recycling program, a donation to an art teacher. These are all better homes for your under 2-inch scraps than a bin in your workspace that you never go into but cannot bring yourself to throw away. And here is the thing about building this system. It takes about an afternoon to do it the first time, and then maintaining it takes about 30 seconds per cutting session, because all you are doing is sorting your scraps into 3 tiers as you cut instead of throwing everything into one bin. The initial sort is a project. The maintenance is a habit, and once that habit is in place, your scrap pile stops being a source of guilt and starts being a genuine creative resource that you look forward to using. Now we are at number 5, and this is the one that ties everything together, because all 4 of the previous steps are really just clearing the path for this one. Number 5 is about your sewing machine setup, and specifically about how to make your machine and the immediate zone around it work so well that you can sit down and be in the flow of actual quilting within 60 seconds of starting a session. 60 seconds from sitting down to sewing your first seam. That is the goal, and it is achievable in even the smallest space if you set this zone up correctly. The first thing I want you to address is thread management, because it is one of the most overlooked sources of sewing machine frustration. When your thread is not feeding consistently and cleanly from its spool, your tension fluctuates, your stitches become uneven, and in the worst cases, you get thread nests on the underside of your quilt sandwich. Those tangled knots of thread that appear on the back of your work and tell you something is wrong with your threading, your tension, or both. The most common cause of thread nests that I see is incorrect upper threading, specifically the thread not being fully seated in the tension discs. On most modern machines, you thread with the presser foot raised, and this is critical, not optional, because raising the foot opens the tension discs and allows the thread to seat fully between them. Thread with the foot down and those discs are closed, your thread is sitting on top of them instead of inside them, and your tension is going to be inconsistent from the very first stitch. This is one of those things. That sounds almost too basic to mention, but I have diagnosed this exact issue in dozens of quilters' setups, and every single time, fixing just this one thing resolved what they thought was a much bigger mechanical problem. The other thread management issue I see constantly is spool orientation. Most quilting thread on a standard spool is wound in a way that assumes the spool is sitting on a horizontal pin feeding from the front. If you have a vertical spool pin and your thread is wound for horizontal delivery, it will twist as it feeds, and that twist accumulates in your stitches in ways that can cause skip stitches, thread breakage, and, yes, more thread nests. Most machines come with both a vertical and a horizontal spool pin option for exactly this reason. Check your thread's wind direction, check your spool pin orientation, and match them correctly. This is free information that will save you an enormous amount of frustration. Now I want to talk about your 1/4-inch seam, because this is where quilting accuracy lives or dies, and in a small, efficient setup, you do not have time to be measuring and adjusting your seam allowance every single session. You need it locked in. A scant 1/4-inch seam allowance, and I mean genuinely scant, as in 1 or 2 threads shy of a true 1/4 inch, is the standard in quilting for a reason. When 2 pieces of fabric are joined and pressed open or to one side, that thread of fabric that goes up and over the seam allowance consumes a tiny amount of your intended measurement. A true 1/4 inch seam, after pressing, comes out just slightly less than a 1/4 inch. By starting with a scant 1/4 inch, you compensate for that loss and your pressed blocks come out to their correct cut measurement. This is why a dedicated 1/4 inch presser foot is one of the highest value notions you can own for quilting. Not because you cannot sew a 1/4 inch without it, you can, but because having the physical guide of the foot's edge removes one more decision and one more potential for drift from every single seam you sew. I also want you to think about what I call your machine's immediate orbit, the 12 to 18 inches around your sewing machine that you can reach without moving your body. In a small setup, this zone has to be surgical. Your seam ripper lives here. Your scissors live here. Your pin dish or your clover clip tray lives here. Your thread snips live here. Nothing else. Every extra item in this orbit is something your hand has to navigate around when you are in flow. And in flow is when you are at your most productive. Guard that orbit fiercely. Everything that does not earn a permanent place in those 12 inches has to live somewhere else, even if somewhere else is just 6 inches further away on the same table. And here is the final thought I want to leave you with, because we have covered a lot of ground today, and I want to make sure the core message lands. All 5 of these things, the audit, the cutting station, the pressing station, the scrap system, and the sewing machine zone, they are all variations of the same idea. You do not solve a small space problem by making the space bigger. You solve it by removing everything that does not serve the work, by giving every tool a home it actually returns to, and by making the path from sitting down to creating as short and as frictionless as possible. That is the whole system. It does not require a renovation. It does not require a budget. It requires an afternoon of honest editing and the discipline to maintain what you set up. I have made quilts in tiny apartments, in shared rooms, on kitchen tables that had to be cleared for dinner every night. I have quilted in conditions that would make a lot of crafting influencers absolutely weep, and every single quilt I finished in those spaces, I finished because the system was solid, not because the space was beautiful. Your space does not have to be beautiful to be functional. It just has to work for you, and now you have 5 specific ways to make sure it does. Go do your audit, start there. Everything else builds from it. And when you come back to this channel, I want to hear which of these 5 things made the biggest difference for you, because I have seen all 5 of them be someone's turning point, and I genuinely want to know which one it is for you. Leave it in the comments and let's talk about it. I will see you in the next one.